There's a moment in the life of an empath that no one prepares them for. It does not arrive with drama. It does not announce itself loudly. There is no explosion, no argument, no final confrontation. There is only a quiet internal shift, a moment when something deep inside says, "Enough." Carl Jung understood this moment well, though he rarely used the word empath. He spoke instead of the sensitive psyche, the individual whose unconscious is more permeable, more receptive, more attuned to the emotional undercurrent of others. Such people feel more, see more, absorb more, and because of this, they are often shaped by the needs, wounds, and projections of those around them. For a long time, the empath survives by adapting. They listen, they give, they accommodate, they understand. They believe that if they can just be patient enough, kind enough, perceptive enough, harmony will follow. But harmony built on self-erasure is not harmony. It is slow psychological exhaustion. Jung warned that when a person consistently neglects their own psychic boundaries, the unconscious begins to compensate. What is not expressed consciously returns with force. And this is where the shift begins. At first, the empath does not change outwardly. They still smile, still show up, still say the right things. But inwardly, something is hardened, not into bitterness, but into clarity. They begin to see patterns they once excused. How their empathy was taken for granted. How their silence was mistaken for consent. How their understanding became a resource others felt entitled to. This realization is painful because it dismantles a long-held identity. The empath has often defined themselves through usefulness, through emotional labor, through being the one who holds everything together. To see that this role has been exploited feels like betrayal, not only by others, but by oneself. Jung would say that this is the moment when the shadow of the empath begins to emerge. The shadow is not cruelty. It is suppressed truth. And for the empath, the shadow contains anger, boundaries, refusal, and self-prioritization, qualities they were taught to associate with selfishness or harm. But these qualities are not dark. They are necessary. The empath who has not integrated their shadow remains vulnerable to endless extraction. They become a psychic reservoir for others' unresolved emotions. And the unconscious will not allow this indefinitely. So the psyche intervenes. Fatigue sets in. Resentment appears. Tolerance evaporates. The empath begins to feel irritated by things they once overlooked. Conversations feel heavier. Requests feel intrusive. Emotional demands feel invasive. This is not regression. It is awakening. Jung believed that growth often begins with disillusionment, the collapse of an ideal that no longer serves the psyche. For the empath, the ideal is often unconditional availability. But unconditional availability is not love. It is self-abandonment disguised as virtue. When the empath gets fed up, it is not because they have stopped caring. It is because they have started caring about themselves. And this changes everything. They no longer rush to fix emotions that are not theirs. They no longer explain themselves endlessly. They no longer absorb chaos in the name of peace. Silence replaces explanation. Distance replaces overexposure. And those around them feel it immediately, because the empath's energy has changed. What once felt soft and open now feels grounded, calm, unmovable. This shift confuses people. Some will accuse the empath of becoming cold. Others will say they have changed, so will feel abandoned. But what is actually happening is far more profound. The empath has stopped leaking. Jung taught that when an individual begins to individuate, when they reclaim their psychic center, the world reacts. Relationships reorganize. Projections intensify. Resistance appears. The empath's fed-up phase is not withdrawal from life. It is withdrawal from unconscious participation. They are no longer willing to play the role assigned to them by others' wounds. And this is deeply threatening, because many people relied on the empath's emotional availability to avoid facing themselves. When that availability disappears, discomfort follows, and discomfort often turns into blame. But the empath no longer internalizes it. Something inside them has settled. They have crossed the threshold. And once crossed, there is no returning to who they were before. Empaths do not attract pain by accident. They attract it because they can hold it. Jung understood that human beings are unconsciously drawn to those who can carry what they cannot. This is not a moral choice. It is a psychological one. The unconscious seeks balance, and it seeks it efficiently. An empath's psyche is open, receptive, and emotionally literate. They sense shifts in mood before words are spoken. They feel tension before it becomes conflict. They intuit needs before they are expressed. To wounded people, this feels like safety, but safety can easily turn into dependence. Those who have not learned to regulate their own inner world instinctively lean on those who can. They offload confusion, anger, sadness, and insecurity onto the empath, not maliciously at first, but habitually. This is emotional extraction. It is subtle, it is normalized, and it is rarely acknowledged. The empath becomes a listener, the stabilizer, the one who understands. Over time, they are no longer met as an equal, but as a container. Jung described this dynamic as projection. People project their disowned emotions onto another person and unconsciously expect them to manage it. The empath becomes a psychological landfill for what others refuse to process. At first, the empath feels valued, needed, important. But being needed is not the same as being respected. And eventually, the cost becomes clear. The empath notices that support flows in one direction, that their struggles are minimized, that when they express limits, discomfort arises, not empathy. This is when resentment begins to form. Not explosive resentment, quiet resentment, the kind that accumulates through 1,000 small moments of being overlooked. Jung believed that resentment is a signal, not a flaw. It indicates a boundary that has been violated repeatedly without acknowledgement. But empaths are often conditioned to ignore the signal. They tell themselves they are overreacting, that others have it worse. That understanding is more important than being understood. This self-dismissal deepens imbalance. The more the empath suppresses their own needs, the more the unconscious compensates. Irritation leaks out, fatigue deepens, joy fades, and then comes the realization. The empath sees that their kindness has become predictable, that others expect access to their emotional energy without reciprocity, that their empathy has been mistaken for infinite capacity. This realization hurts, because it forces the empath to confront a painful truth. Some people do not love them as a person, but as a function. They are valued for what they provide, not for who they are. Jung warned that when a person's identity is built around being useful, they risk losing contact with their own self. They become a role rather than an individual. The empath's fed-up phase begins when this role collapses, when they see clearly that no amount of understanding will transform someone who refuses self-responsibility. This is a sobering moment, because the empath has often believed, consciously or unconsciously, that their patience could heal others, that their presence could save relationships, that if they just tried harder, things would change. But Jung was clear. Transformation cannot be done for another. It must be chosen. The empath cannot carry another person's shadow indefinitely without being consumed by it. And so the psyche intervenes again. The empath begins to detach, not emotionally at first, but energetically. They feel less compelled to respond immediately, less inclined to fix, less tolerant of emotional chaos. This detachment alarms others, because it disrupts an unconscious contract. The contract was never spoken, but it was enforced. You feel for me, so I don't have to. When the empath breaks his contract, resistance appears. Guilt is applied. Accusations emerge. You've changed. You're cold now. You don't care anymore. But the empath knows something has shifted internally. They are no longer available for emotional labor without consent. This is not cruelty. It is differentiation. Jung taught that individuation requires withdrawing projections, both those we place on others and those others place on us. For the empath, this means reclaiming emotions they have been carrying that were never theirs. Anger, disappointment, frustration, grief. These emotions surface not to punish, but to restore balance. The empath's fed-up phase is often misunderstood as hardness. In reality, it is integration. They are integrating assertiveness, discernment, and self-priority, qualities long exiled to the shadow. This integration changes how they show up. They no longer over-explain. They no longer justify boundaries. They no longer absorb emotional chaos to maintain peace. And this is where the rare mindset begins to form. A mindset that values inner equilibrium over external harmony. A mindset that understands that empathy without boundaries is self-destruction. The empath is no longer willing to bleed quietly. And once this line is crossed, nothing returns to how it was. When an empath reaches the point of being fed up, something rare begins to form. Not anger, not revenge, not bitterness. Clarity. Jung believed that clarity is one of the most destabilizing forces in human relationships. Confusion keeps systems running. Ambiguity allows roles to persist. But clarity ends unconscious arrangements. The fed-up empath develops a mindset that few people recognize at first because it is quiet. They stop explaining themselves. This is often misunderstood. People assume silence means withdrawal, apathy, or punishment. But the empath's silence is not a tactic. It is a boundary. For most of their life, the empath used words to bridge gaps, to soothe tensions, to make others comfortable, to clarify misunderstandings before they became conflicts. But words were often wasted. Jung observed that explanation is futile when the other person is not listening to understand, but to defend. Many conversations are not exchanges of truth, but negotiations of control. The fed-up empath senses this immediately. They recognize when a conversation is not about resolution, but about extracting reassurance, when it is not about growth, but about restoring the old imbalance. So they stop participating. Silence becomes discernment. This silence is not passive. It is alert, observant, grounded. The empath watches rather than reacts. And this is unsettling, because people were accustomed to the empath filling emotional space, softening edges, translating feelings, absorbing tension. Without that buffer, reality becomes sharper. People feel their own emotions more acutely. Their own insecurities surface. Their own unprocessed feelings return to them. And instead of gratitude, many respond with discomfort. This is when accusations intensify. You're different now. You've changed. You don't care like you used to. But the empath understands something crucial. They did not stop caring. They stopped carrying. Jung taught that psychological maturity involves withdrawing energy from what does not reciprocate or nourish the self. This withdrawal often looks like indifference on the outside, but internally it is alignment. The fed-up empath's mindset prioritizes inner stability over external approval. This is rare. Most people live externally referenced lives. Their sense of self fluctuates based on feedback, reactions, and validation. The empath once did this too, measuring their worth by how needed they were. But now, the reference point has shifted inward. They ask different questions. Is this healthy for me? Is this reciprocal? Does this cost me more than it gives? These questions change everything. They stop responding out of guilt. They stop rescuing others from discomfort. They stop feeling responsible for emotions they did not create. This does not make them cruel. It makes them sovereign. Jung believed that sovereignty of the psyche is the goal of individuation. A sovereign psyche is not isolated. It is self-governing. It can engage without being consumed. It can care without collapsing. The fed-up empath begins to embody this. Their presence becomes calm, but firm, warm but contained, open but not porous. This calm is powerful, not because it dominates, but because it cannot be manipulated easily. People who thrived on emotional leverage feel this immediately. They attempt to provoke reactions. They escalate drama. They test boundaries. But the empath no longer takes the bait. They respond slowly or not at all. They choose words carefully or remain silent. They allow others to sit with their own discomfort. This restraint is often mistaken for coldness, but it is actually respect for themselves and for others' capacity to handle their own inner world. Jung warned that rescuing someone from their emotions robs them of growth. Suffering, when faced consciously, initiates transformation. When constantly avoided, it stagnates. The fed-up empath stops interfering with this process. They no longer shield others from consequences. They no longer translate feelings that others refuse to articulate. They no longer manage relationships alone. And in doing so, they create space. Space for honesty. Space for responsibility. Space for truth. Some relationships do not survive this shift. They were built on imbalance. Others transform. Those capable of self-reflection step forward. They meet the empath as an equal rather than a caretaker. They adjust. They grow. But many fall away. And the empath lets them. This is perhaps the hardest part. Because the empath is deeply relational by nature. Letting go does not come easily. But they now understand that proximity without respect is not connection. It is erosion. The rare mindset of the fed-up empath values depth over closeness, truth over harmony, integrity over approval. They are no longer impressed by intensity. They are no longer swayed by emotional urgency. They are no longer afraid of being misunderstood. This last point is crucial. Fear of misunderstanding once kept them over-explaining, over-giving, over-functioning. Now, they accept that not everyone will understand them, and that this is not a problem to solve. Jung believed that the individuated person is often misunderstood because they are no longer predictable. They do not move according to collective expectations. The empath's fed-up phase marks the beginning of individuation. They are no longer defined by their role in others' lives. They are becoming themselves. And this calm, this restraint, this refusal to be drained, it signals something irreversible. The empath has reclaimed their center. When an empath truly reaches their limit, their relationships begin to reorganize, quietly but decisively, not because the empath announces change, not because they issue ultimatums, but because they are no longer willing to contort themselves to keep bonds intact. Jung believed that every relationship exists within a psychological economy. Energy flows in patterns. Roles are reinforced through repetition. When one person changes inwardly, the entire structure must adjust or collapse. This is exactly what happens when an empath gets fed up. Some people disappear. Not dramatically, not angrily. They simply fade. Messages slow. Invitations stop. Emotional access quietly closes. These were often relationships most dependent on the empath's availability. One sustained by listening, rescuing, accommodating, and emotional translation. Without that constant input, there is nothing left to hold them together. This loss can feel confusing. The empath may wonder how something that seems so close could vanish so easily. But Jung would say that what disappears was not connection, it was function. Once the function ends, the bond dissolves. Other relationships react differently. Some people resist the change. They push harder. They demand explanations. They attempt guilt, nostalgia, or emotional pressure to restore the old dynamic. Why are you like this now? Why are you distant? Why can't you be how you used to be? But the empath no longer negotiates their boundaries. They understand now that clarity does not require consensus. Jung taught that individuation often feels like betrayal to those who benefited from our unconsciousness. When you stop playing your part, others feel destabilized, even threatened. But not all relationships end. A few transform. These are the rare ones. People capable of reflection notice the shift and respond with curiosity rather than accusation. They ask questions without defensiveness. They take responsibility for their side of the dynamic. With these people, the empath experiences something new, reciprocity. For the first time, they are not the only one holding emotional space. They're not the only one adapting. They are met. These relationships deepen. They become slower, more honest, less dramatic, but far more real. Yet even with this growth, a quiet loneliness often emerges. The empath has stepped out of familiar patterns, but has not yet fully formed new ones. The old world no longer fits, and the new one is still taking shape. Jung described this phase as the in-between, a liminal psychological space where identity reorganizes. It is uncomfortable, uncertain, and profoundly transformative. In this phase, the empath may feel unseen. Not misunderstood, but unseen, because their old role was visible. Their new self is subtle. They are no longer the emotional anchor for everyone else. And this absence can feel like emptiness. But this emptiness is not lack. It is space. Space where the empath can finally hear themselves without interference. Space where desires emerge that were long suppressed. space where exhaustion gives way to rest. This is where strength quietly forms, not the loud, performative kind, but the kind that does not need to prove itself. The empath begins to enjoy solitude differently, not as escape, but as restoration. They no longer fear being alone with their thoughts, because those thoughts are no longer drowned out by others' needs. They begin to trust themselves. Jung believed that trust in one's inner experience is a foundation of psychological maturity. Without it, a person is always looking outward for permission to exist as they are. The fed-up empath no longer seeks permission. They may still care deeply. They may still love, but they no longer sacrifice themselves to maintain proximity. This shift can feel isolating in a world that rewards self-abandonment disguised as kindness, but it is also liberating. The empath realizes that peace does not come from managing everyone else's emotional state. It comes from respecting their own. They stop confusing intensity with intimacy. They stop mistaking obligation for love. They stop equating endurance with virtue. And slowly, a new identity stabilizes, one not built on being needed, but on being whole. This phase requires courage, because the empath must grieve not only lost relationships, but lost illusions. The illusion that if they gave enough, others would eventually give back. The illusion that self-sacrifice would be recognized and protected. Grief surfaces here. Deep, quiet grief. But grief, when allowed, clears the psyche. Jung believed that grief is a form of integration. It releases energy bound to what can no longer be sustained. It frees the individual to move forward without dragging the past behind them. The empath who allows this grief emerges lighter, not hardened, not closed, but cleaner. They no longer feel compelled to overextend. They no longer feel guilty for choosing peace. They no longer apologize for having limits. This is not emotional withdrawal. It is emotional alignment. And from this alignment, something powerful begins to take shape. A life not organized around exhaustion, but around intention. There's a final transformation that occurs when an empath is truly fed up. It is not dramatic. It is not announced. And it does not seek validation. It settles. Jung believed that the most profound psychological shifts do not look impressive from the outside. They look ordinary, quiet, even invisible. But inwardly, they rearrange everything. This is what happens to the fed-up empath. They stop defining themselves through reaction. They no longer ask, how will this affect others? Before asking, how does this affect me? This is not selfishness. It is orientation. For most of their life, the empath's psyche was outward-facing. They scanned environments, moods, and emotional undercurrents automatically. The sensitivity once kept them safe. It allowed them to adapt, anticipate, and survive. But what once protected them eventually exhausted them. The fed-up empath turns inward, not to withdraw from life, but to reclaim authorship of it. They begin to live deliberately. They choose who has access to their time, energy, and emotional depth. They no longer feel compelled to respond immediately, to soothe tension instantly, or to rescue others from discomfort. This restraint is not indifference. It is respect for psychic limits. Jung emphasized that limits are essential for consciousness. Without them, the ego dissolves into chaos or is consumed by the demands of others. A psyche without boundaries is not compassionate. It is vulnerable. The fed-up empath understand this now. They no longer confuse empathy with obligation. They understand that feeling another's pain does not mean carrying it. This distinction changes everything. Their nervous system begins to calm. Their body relaxes. Their intuition sharpens. They are no longer constantly flooded by others' emotions because they are no longer unconsciously available to absorb them. This creates space. In that space, the empath begins to hear their own voice clearly for the first time in years. Not the voice shaped by expectation, not the voice shaped by guilt, but the voice of preference, desire, and truth. They notice what drains them. They notice what nourishes them. They notice when something feels wrong, even if it looks right, and they act accordingly. This is the rare mindset, a mindset that does not rush to explain itself, a mindset that does not seek permission, a mindset that trusts inner signals over external noise. Most people never reach this stage. not because they are incapable, but because it requires enduring misunderstanding without retreating back into old roles. It requires tolerating solitude without filling it with distraction. It requires letting go of identities built on being needed. The empath who reaches this stage is no longer easily manipulated. Guilt no longer works. Urgency no longer works. Emotional pressure no longer works, because they recognize these tactics as unconscious attempts to restore the old dynamic. They respond differently now, sometimes with a calm no, sometimes with silence, sometimes with distance, and sometimes with nothing at all. This absence of reaction is deeply unsettling to those who relied on the empath's emotional availability. But the empath no longer sees this as their responsibility. Jung taught that individuation often requires disappointing others in order to remain faithful to the self. This is not cruelty. It is psychological integrity. The fed-up empath embodies this integrity. They are still empathetic, but selectively. They are still kind, but not endlessly available. They are still deep, but no longer exposed. They have learned that empathy without self-respect is self-harm. This realization reshapes their entire life. Work becomes more intentional. Relationships become fewer, but deeper. Rest becomes non-negotiable. Joy becomes quieter, but more consistent. They are no longer chasing harmony. They are embodying balance. And balance changes the way the world responds to them. People sense a shift. Some feel safer. Some feel challenged. Some feel shut out. But the empath no longer adjusts themselves to manage these reactions. They allow others to feel what they feel. This is perhaps the greatest change of all. The empath stops interfering with other people's inner work. They stop preventing discomfort. They stop softening consequences. They stop buffering reality. This does not make them harsh. It makes them honest. Jung believed that honesty is a form of love, one that respects the other's capacity to grow. Shielding someone from discomfort may feel compassionate, but it often delays transformation. The fed-up empath no longer delays their own life or others' growth. They stand still, grounded, present, unmoved by chaos that once consumed them. This does not mean life becomes easy, but it becomes clear. The empath knows what they will tolerate and what they will not. They know when to engage and when to walk away. They know that peace is not found by pleasing everyone, but by living in alignment with oneself. This clarity is irreversible. Once the empath experiences life without constant emotional overextension, they cannot return to unconscious self-sacrifice. The body will not allow it. The psyche will not permit it. They have crossed the threshold, from reactivity to choice, from obligation to intention, from depletion to self-respect. This is why everything changes when an empath gets fed up, not because they become someone else, but because they finally stop abandoning who they are. And in doing so, they reclaim something precious. Their life, there's a quiet peace that arrives after the storm. Not relief, not victory, but peace. Jung believed that peace emerges not when conflict disappears, but when the psyche is no longer divided against itself. When inner truth and outer life are no longer at war, something settles deep within. This is where the fed-up empath eventually arrives. They do not feel triumphant. They do not feel superior. They feel aligned. For the first time, their inner world and outer behavior match. They say no when something feels wrong. They say yes when something feels right. And they no longer explain either choice excessively. This simplicity is earned. It comes after years of overthinking, overfeeling, and overgiving. It comes after exhaustion forced honesty. It comes after the psyche demanded balance. The empath realizes something profound. They were never meant to carry the emotional weight of everyone around them. They were meant to feel deeply, but not endlessly sacrifice themselves to preserve comfort. Jung taught that empathy is a gift, not a duty. When it becomes a duty, it turns against the one who possesses it. What begins as compassion becomes compulsion. The fed-up empath has broken this compulsion. They now understand that empathy must be guided by consciousness, or becomes self-destruction. This understanding reshapes how they move through the world. They listen, but they do not absorb. They care, but they do not collapse. They love, but they do not disappear. Their energy is no longer scattered. It is contained, and contained energy becomes presence. People feel this presence, even without words, even without explanation. There's a groundedness now, a steadiness, a calm that does not need to convince. The empath no longer seeks to be understood by everyone. They are comfortable being misunderstood. Jung believed this was a hallmark of individuation. The individuated person accepts that not all inner truth can be translated into social language. Some things must simply be lived. The empath lives it. They no longer chase harmony at the expense of self-respect. They no longer fear solitude. They no longer fear disappointing others. They understand that disappointment is often the price of honesty, and honesty is a foundation of peace. This does not mean the empath becomes isolated or closed. In fact, the opposite happens. They become more selective and therefore more genuine. The relationships that remain are real, mutual, alive. There is laughter without tension, silence without fear, space without guilt. These connections nourish rather than drain. And the empath finally experiences what they once offered so freely, being held. But perhaps the most important change is this. The empath trusts themselves. They trust their intuition. They trust their limits. They trust their inner signals. This trust becomes their compass. When something feels off, they listen. When something feels right, they lean in. When something feels draining, they step back. No debate, no justification, no apology. Jung believed that the self, the deepest organizing center of the psyche, guides us quietly when we learn to listen. The fed-up empath has learned. They no longer live reactively. They live intentionally. And from this place, life simplifies, not because it becomes easy, but because it becomes honest. The empath no longer asks, "How much can I endure?" They ask, "Is this aligned with who I am?" That single question changes everything. This is why when an empath gets fed up, everything changes. Not overnight, not loudly, but permanently, because they stop betraying themselves for peace. And in doing so, they discover a deeper peace, one that does not depend on being needed, approved of, or understood. A peace that comes from finally standing on their own side. And once that happens, there is no going back.